Hi there, my name's Conor McHugh. I'm an Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Southampton, and I want to talk to you about a problem in the philosophy of perception. I like to go out for a walk near a lake locally and look at a beautiful birch tree by the shore of the lake. When I do that, it seems to me that I'm directly aware of or presented with the tree itself, an object that exists out in the world independently of me and my perception of it, with bark and leaves and branches and so on. Direct realism is the view that that's exactly what's happening. So according to direct realism, the immediate objects of perception are mind-independent objects out in the world, like trees and tables and houses and so on. Direct realism stands in contrast with indirect realism. Indirect realism is the view that the immediate objects of perception are mind-dependent objects, sense data, that somehow represent and are caused by external objects. So according to indirect realism, although it seems to me that I'm directly aware of the birch tree, really I'm only directly aware of sense data. These are intermediaries of a sort which intervene between me and the tree. So contrary to how things seem to us, we're never really directly aware of mind-independent objects. According to direct realism, there are no such intermediaries. Now, importantly, direct realism is not the view that things are always how they appear. So sometimes objects aren't how they appear. They might appear, for example, to be colored differently from how they really are in peculiar lighting conditions. But according to the direct realist, this isn't because there are other objects we're aware of that are like that, as the indirect realist claims. So it's not that there are some other things, such as sense data, that are that color. Rather, we're aware of the object, but it appears to be a color that it's not. Nonetheless, cases where the world isn't how it appears are often thought to raise a difficult challenge for direct realism. Now, there are two kinds of case that are relevant here, and it's important to be clear on the difference between them. In one kind of case, you have an object that appears other than how it is. So, for example, you put a pencil into a glass of water and it appears bent, even though it's straight. And that's the case of illusion. In another kind of case, there's no object out there in the world at all. So you seem to be seeing something, but there's nothing there. Such as when Macbeth seems to be seeing a dagger before him, and yet there is no dagger. And that's the case of hallucination. Illusion and hallucination are both cases of what we call non-veridical perception. So you're not seeing things as they are, but they raise somewhat different challenges for direct realism. So let's take the case of illusion first. So suppose you're seeing the pencil and it appears to be bent to you. We can ask, what is your experience of when you see the pencil as bent? Well, it might seem that it certainly can't be directly of the pencil itself, because you're seeing something bent and the pencil isn't bent. But the direct realist rejects this line of reasoning. The direct realist can say, it's not that you're seeing something bent, rather you're seeing something straight, the pencil, which is straight, but it appears bent to you. After all, the direct realist says that mind-independent objects like pencils can be the immediate object of your experience even if they don't appear exactly as they are. So the direct realist will say, you're directly aware of the pencil even if you're not directly aware of its property of straightness. Now, you might find that convincing or not, but what I want to focus on here is the way that hallucination raises a somewhat different challenge and potentially more formidable challenge for direct realism. So suppose Macbeth is having his hallucination of a dagger. Again, we can ask, well, what is Macbeth's experience an experience of? If we want to treat this case in the same way as the direct realist treats the case of illusion, it would seem that we should say that his experience is an experience of the dagger. So the object of his experience is a dagger, in the same way that when you see the pencil in water, the object of your experience is the pencil. But of course that cannot be true, because there is no dagger. That's the whole point. There's nothing there. There's no dagger to be the object of his experience. More generally, when we hallucinate, there is no external mind-independent object that the experience could possibly be an experience of. That's what distinguishes hallucination from illusion. There's no object out in the world that could be the object you're experiencing. So we might say, since in this case there is no external mind-independent object, the object must be internal and mind-dependent. That is, it's an experience of sense data. So Macbeth, when he hallucinates the dagger, the immediate object of his experience is sense data that are in some way dagger-like. But if we say that about the case of hallucination, then shouldn't we say the same thing about veridical perception? That is, about the case where Macbeth sees a real dagger. After all, the experience might be just the same whether there is or isn't a dagger there. So whether he's hallucinating or having a veridical experience, the experience might be just the same. And it would be very odd to think that there are these things, sense data, whose only job, so to speak, is to be the objects of hallucinations, and that don't do anything otherwise. In particular, that don't do anything, that have no role when we're perceiving veridically or normally. They just pop up, as it were, in order to be the objects of hallucinations. That would be a rather peculiar picture. A third option for the direct realist is to say that Macbeth's experience when he's hallucinating the dagger is of nothing at all. It has no object. Now you might say that's a complete non-runner, because after all Macbeth is experiencing something. But the direct realist will say, well, yes, in the sense that Macbeth is having an experience, clearly. But the experience, they'll say, has no object. There's nothing that he's aware of. In the veridical case, when Macbeth sees a dagger, the experience has an object, namely the dagger. But in this hallucinatory case, it doesn't have any object. And that's the difference between the two cases. Now note that there seems to be something kind of right about this. So there surely is a sense in which Macbeth isn't really seeing anything. After all, there's nothing there for him to see, even if it seems to him that he is. But the worry about this response is that now it seems hard to explain the character of Macbeth's hallucinatory experience, what it's like for him. His experience isn't empty. Indeed, it's just like an experience of genuinely seeing a dagger. Well, how can this be, if not because the experience has an object that gives it this character? Something dagger-like, if you will. To illustrate, suppose that Macbeth has a twin, Shmacbeth, and Shmacbeth hallucinates not a dagger, but a kitten, having a much nicer time of it. So Macbeth and Shmacbeth have two different hallucinatory experiences, very different. How do we explain the difference between those two experiences, if not by saying that they experience different objects. So the upshot is that it seems to be very hard for a theory of perception to do justice to both veridical perception and hallucination. It seems that they can be the same as far as the experience itself goes, as far as what it's like to have that experience goes. But in the veridical case, it seems to be directly of external mind-independent objects. Whereas in the case of hallucination, although it also often seems that way, that just can't be so because there is no external mind-independent object. So we seem to be either forced to deny that veridical perception is really how it seems, or to be left with no account of hallucination and how it seems to have the same character as veridical experience. I'll leave you with some questions that you can think about having watched this video. I want to thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting, you can see more that have been made by my colleagues in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Southampton.